Now, last week I began a very new series entitled Avoiding the Pitfalls of Life. So let me give you the second pitfall that you need to be aware of. If you're taking notes, write this down. The second pitfall you need to be aware of is misplaced priorities. Now, if you were here 2 weeks ago, you know that Bobby preached on the subject of priorities, and he did a great job. But I'm going to go in a different way or a different direction. I'm going to be covering different material. Same subject, but different material. So don't think that you're going to hear the very same sermon just repackaged. No, this is brand new material. Now, Bobby did a great job in explaining what we mean by priorities by giving you the etymology of the word. You see, the word priority is derived from the Latin word prior, which of course means before. If I said I went over my notes prior to taking the test, what I mean by that is I went over my notes before I took the test, because that's what prior means. It means before. So if something is a priority, it means that it's placed before everything else in terms of importance. Does that make sense? Good. Now, most of us don't just have one thing that's important to us. No. We have several things that are important to us, which means we're going to place those things before the things that aren't very important to us. That's why we call them priorities. Now, whenever I have a list of priorities, I have to determine what my first priority is, and what my second priority is, and what my third priority is as I go down the list. What I'm doing is prioritizing my list. I'm taking what I consider to be the most important thing on my list, and I'm placing it at the very top. So it is priority number one. Therefore, it's placed before everything else. Then I take the second most important thing on my list, and I place it right under the top priority, but it's before everything else. So it's priority number two. And I continue to do that until I finish prioritizing my list. Now, when it comes to life, some people have what we call misplaced priorities. And that's what I'm going to be talking about this morning. But first, let me explain what I mean by misplaced priorities. I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. The word misplaced means to put in the wrong place. Now, most of you think of your keys when you think that as I misplaced my keys or I misplaced my wallet. And that's what it means. It means to put in the wrong place. So if you have misplaced priorities, it means that your list of priorities are not in the right order. In other words, you have things that really aren't that important at the top of your list. And you have things that are important at the bottom of your list. That's what we mean by misplaced priorities. What you think is important really isn't. And what you think isn't important really is. And that can cause big problems in your life. And let me give you one example just to show you how misplaced priorities can really screw your life up. And let's use a common one. Let's talk about college kids, because it's time for kids to go back to college. In fact, I think tomorrow for most universities around here, it's the first day of school. And you think about your graduating senior now, they're 18 years old, they're going off to college, and you go there, you decorate their dorm room, you get them ready for college, and then you sit them down and you tell them, your number one priority is to make good grades. We sent you here to learn. Now, we want you to have fun, we're not saying that, but your number one priority is to make good grades. Now, that might be their number one priority, and it might not be, because this is the first time in their life that they're not living at home. This is the first time in their life that mama's not going to come in and get them out of bed, cook breakfast for them, and make sure they've gone to school. So that first day of school comes, and they're there, and they're doing pretty well, maybe the first week or two. And then they find out that there's parties. And they start going to parties. And they start getting back to the dorm room later and later. And before you know it, they're sleeping in, and they're not going to class. And all of a sudden, their priorities shift. Now, number one on their list is having a good time. And studying is way down here on the list until they get their grades. And you know, those things come out. Midterm, you start getting your grades and you realize, oh my gosh, I'm flunking all of my classes. And they run to see their professors and they say, what can I do? And they say, I'm sorry. Even if you make an A on everything else, you're still going to come up with a D. And if you don't make an A on everything else, you're going to have an F. Maybe you need to drop this class. And what the professor doesn't realize is it's the same way in every one of your classes. So what happens? That kid flunks out. they have student debts with no degree. And even if they go back, they're going to have to retake all of the classes that they flunked. So it's costing them time and money. Or should I say it's costing their parents time and money, because time, now they have more years to support them, and now they got to pay for those classes all over again. Yeah. What caused that? Misplaced priorities. And people, that's just one example of how misplaced priorities can wreak havoc in a person's life. So how do you know what should be on the top of your list of priorities? How do you know what's most important in life? And what's the second most important thing in life? And what's the third most important thing in life? Who decides that? And is it different for each person, or is it the same for everyone? Well, those are very important questions, because if you don't get your priorities right, it can cause some really major problems in your life. It can cause problems in your marriage. It can cause problems in your relationship with your children. It can cause problems at work. In fact, it can cause problems in just about every area of your life. So, how do you know what should be on the top of your priority list? How do you know what's most important in life, and what's the second most important thing in life, and the third? Well, the good news is the Bible tells us. Did you know that? Yeah, it's true. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Matthew, chapter 22. We're going to read verses 35 through 40, and we're going to find out what should be the top priority in everyone's life. And what's the second most important thing in life? The Bible tells us. Notice what it says. One of them, an expert in religious law, tried to trap Jesus with this question. Teacher, which is the most important commandment in the law of Moses? Jesus replied, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments. Now, I want you to notice that in verse 36, an expert in the law. Now, what is an expert in the law? Well, at the time of Jesus, you had this group of people called scribes. They didn't have the printing press, so if you had a scroll that had the Word of God on it, or any type of book, someone had to write it themselves. They had to actually copy it. They were called scribes. Now, when it came to the Hebrew Scriptures, these scribes couldn't make a mistake. If they made a mistake, they had to destroy it all. You couldn't just X it out. There was no way to erase it. So they wanted to make sure that they didn't make any mistakes. In fact, it's kind of interesting if you ever go to Israel and you go to a place called Qumran, that's where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they found a whole copy of Isaiah. And it was written in the 2nd and 3rd century before Jesus Christ. And what's interesting is that book of Isaiah is the very same as our book of Isaiah. Why? Because the scribes made sure that they didn't make any mistakes. But in order to do that, they would only write for so long. And then they would take a break. But what they did in their breaks is they studied what they were teaching. What they were writing. And so one of the things that they would do is they would study this and then they would write it. And then they would study it and they would write it. In fact, it was the scribes that normally taught in the synagogues. So this was called an expert of the law. So you have this person in verse 36, an expert in the law, and he's trying to trap Jesus, and he asks him the question, which commandment is the most important? Now, does everyone know what a commandment is? We think we do, but what's a commandment? A commandment is a command to do something. It's an order. So notice what the expert in the law was asking Jesus. He says, of all the things that God has commanded us to do, which is the most important? In other words, if we made a list of everything that we're supposed to do according to God, what would be the most important thing on the list? In a sense, he was wanting to know what our top priority is supposed to be. Now, Jesus didn't have to think about it. In fact, he didn't hesitate at all. Of all the things that we're supposed to do, the most important thing is to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. In other words, on the list of things that you're supposed to do, this is number one. This is the most important. This is your top priority. So according to Jesus, loving God should be on our priority list. And it should be the top thing on our priority list. So what should be number 2 on our list of priorities? We'll look at verse number 39. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. So number 2 on our list of priorities is to love our neighbor. So take a look at what Jesus said our top 2 priorities should be. The most important thing is to love God. The second most important thing is to love others. Now I want you to notice that Jesus only gave us 2 things to put on our priority list. He didn't give us a third. Why? Is Jesus trying to tell us something? Well, of course he is. He's trying to tell us that life is all about relationships. You see, it's relationships that should be in our list of priorities, not things. Now, this is so important that I want to say it again, but I want to make sure that I say it in a different way, just to make sure that you get it. This man asked Jesus, what's most important? And Jesus answered, it's not what's most important, it's who is most important. In other words, things aren't important, people are. Now, if you don't believe that, think about what happens when a loved one becomes gravely ill and you think they're going to die. What happens? All of a sudden, you could care less about that nice house, that nice car, that big salary. You give it all away if it would make that loved one better, if it would save their life. That's when you realize that things really aren't that important, but people are. So when you list your priorities, make sure that people are on the list, not things. If things are on your list, then you have misplaced priorities. In other words, you haven't come to grips yet with what's most important in life. Hopefully that won't happen. Hopefully you'll get your priorities right before someone in your family who you love dearly is gravely ill and you think they're going to pass away. Or maybe your wife leaves you or whatever. You know, it's in tragedies like that that we realize what's really important. And people, it's people, not things. Now, men can have a difficult time grasping this concept because they have a tendency to confuse what they do for a living with who they are as a person. It's true. Think about it. When a man is introduced to another man, what's the first thing that he will ask that man after the introduction? The very first thing he'll ask is, well, what do you do for a living? But there's a reason that he's asking that. It's because men equate what they do for a living with who they are as a person. Every man does that. That's Bobby Wayne. He's an associate pastor, a comedian. That's Steve Jones. He's a dentist. That's Randall Miller. Now, wait a minute. You left something out. You didn't tell me what Randall does, so I don't know who he is. You see, as men, we equate what we do for a living with who we are as a person. People, I'm Allen Nolan, pastor of Cornerstone Fellowship. This is my wife, Lisa. Now, notice that we don't have the tendency to do the same thing with women. But the bottom line is men have the tendency to equate what they do for a living with who they are as a person, which means that we also have the tendency to confuse the what with the who. And that's also why we have a greater tendency to put things on our list of priorities rather than people, which explains why men are more apt to have misplaced priorities than women. Now, women is not to say that you can't have misplaced priorities, because you can. But I want you to understand it's usually men who have the problem with this because they begin to confuse the what with the who. It's true. It really is. And I'll prove it to you. If I were to ask all of our men here to list the top 3 priorities in their life, 90% of the men here in this congregation would list these 3 things: God, family, work. Now, those might not be their 3 top priorities, but they know that it should be, right? Every man's going, well, pastor might be looking at these. My wife might look over here, so I'm going to put God number 1. That makes me look good. I'm going to put family number 2 because I hope to get lucky tonight, right? And then I'm going to put work number 3 because I'm finally going to be honest. Now, according to Jesus, only 2 of the 3 on that list are biblical priorities. 1 isn't. Which one of those things on that list isn't a biblical priority according to Jesus? Work. Why? Because it's a thing, not a person. But men will list it every time. Why? Because they equate what they do for a living with who they are as a person. And for men, what they buy is also considered a reflection of who they are. The house we live in with men reflects who we are as a person. The car we drive reflects who we are as a person. The clothes we wear, can you see what this reflects about me? Reflects who we are as a person. And again, that's why men have a greater tendency to put things on their list of priorities rather than people. Yeah. They have the tendency to have misplaced priorities more than women do. And it usually takes a tragedy to wake a man up to the fact that they have misplaced priorities. Or it takes their wife leaving them to wake them up to the fact that things are less important than people are. It takes their child getting sick and near death to wake them up to the fact that things are not as important as people. But let's back up. Because I know that most men here are disagreeing with me about work not being placed on the list of priorities. Let's be honest. How many of you are going, no, Pastor, I know you're spiritual. You live in that spiritual world. You don't live in the real world. I live in the real world. But you're thinking that because I'm telling you that work shouldn't be placed on it. And how many of you men are going, that's just not right? Raise your hand. Yeah, I see the one honest person. We got one person going to heaven here. One person. But you see, I know men think that way. But I want you to understand, I'm not saying that work's not important. Listen to me. Work is very important. But you need to understand why you work if you want to get your priorities straight. You see, if you work for the right reasons, then you don't have to put it on your list of priorities. Yeah. Because it's understood. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. I work for two reasons. Number one, because I love God and I want to use my gifts, talents, and abilities to glorify Him. Colossians chapter 3, verse number 23 says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for men. So, when I work hard, I'm doing it for God in order to glorify Him, in order to make Him look good. The second reason I work is because I love my family and I want to do more than just take care of their needs. I want to be able to bless them with nice things. Notice what 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse number 8 says. If anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for his immediate family, his wife and kids. So we're supposed to provide for all of our relatives, but especially for our wives and kids. In other words, I'm not just going to meet their needs. I'm going to bless them with good things. I want them to wear nice clothes. I want them to drive a nice car. I want them to have nice things. Now let's keep going. It says, if anyone does not provide for his relatives, especially for his immediate family, he has denied the faith. That's something that God has placed within us. And he's worse than an unbeliever because even an unbeliever knows that he has a responsibility to take care of his family. Men, listen to me. If you're not providing for your family, you're scum. I don't know how else to put it. It is your job to provide for your family, and especially for your immediate family, which means that you don't just want to provide for their needs, but you want to bless them with good things. God has placed that inside of man. That's why it's an abomination for a man to be lazy. So as a man, I love my family by providing for them, and that's why I work, and I work hard. In fact, let me elaborate a little more on this if you don't mind. My girls were always very appreciative for what we gave them. They really didn't ask for much. They didn't. But every once in a while, something would come up and they would need something. And maybe what they needed was pretty expensive. At least it was expensive for my salary at that time. And when I bought it for them, I don't know why, but my girls would always apologize. That always kind of made me feel bad. I'd feel a little guilty because they felt guilty for asking me that. And you know what I would tell them? I would say, honey, you don't understand. The reason I work is because of you. I work for you. Not only to provide for your needs, but to give you good things. You are the reason I work. In fact, if you ask my girls today, why does your daddy work? Both of my girls would say he works for me. Because that's what I always told them. And that's why I don't have to list work on my priority list. People, it's understood. I love my family, so I work. I love God, so I work. Now, if you're not working for those two reasons, then you're working for the wrong reasons. Let me say that again. If you're not working for those two reasons, then you're working for the wrong reasons, which means that you probably have misplaced priorities. And that's probably the reason you place your work over your family. It's because you don't understand the reason you work is for your kids and for your wife. You know, my wife thinks I'm a little morbid. My kids think that I'm morbid because, I'll be honest, I carry a pretty good chunk of life insurance. And I pay myself second. I pay God first. I pay myself second. It goes to retirement. And I'm always telling my wife, now you listen to me. Something ever happens to me, I've set you up and it's good, but you don't go marry some old man that wants to spend the money that I worked hard for. I don't mind if you remarry, but you understand you live on his money. My money's going to my kids. And I told her, you can go ahead and remarry. I just want one picture. Hang it over the bedroom wall. I want a Bible in my left hand, and I want my hand pointed down and my eyes looking down. But feel free to remarry. Anyways. But I want you to understand, the reason I work is for my family. So I do not have to put work on my list of priorities. I don't have to do that. My kids know Dad works and Dad will provide. My wife knows that I'll work and I will provide. I don't have to put it on the list of priorities. Now, to be honest with you, there are more than just two things on my priority list, because the two things that Jesus mentioned could be subdivided into different categories or into more categories. Let me show you what my priorities are to give an example of what I'm talking about. Here's my priorities, and yours will be a little bit different because I'm a minister, all right? Yours might look different. Number one is God. I do a lot of funerals. I go to the hospital when people are on their deathbed. And they're telling me what they want at their funeral. And I see people who are scared of dying. And I understand because you've never done that before. But I don't understand being scared of where you're going because you know where you're going. And I truly believe this. When it's time for me to go, Jesus is coming to get me, to grab my hand and take me. And I have no fear of death. Because I'm going to step from this dimension into the next dimension. And that's what death will be. So God's number one on my list. My wife is number two. My children are number three. I understood early on if I'm going to give my children the home they need, then they need to see me model what's most important. And my wife is most important to me, and my children are number three. Extended family is number four. My siblings, my nephews, my nieces, etc. Church leaders are number five. Church family is number six, and those outside of the church are number seven. Now again, mine looks a little bit different because I'm a pastor. Now, in order to support my wife and children, my work will take priority over the last four groups of people on this list. Let me say that again because you might not have caught that. In order to support my wife and kids, my work will take priority over the last four groups of people on this list. Because you need to understand what priorities are. The thing on the top list, it comes before everything. The thing that's second on the list, it's right after the top one, but it's before everything else on the list. The third, which is my children, it's underneath God, wife, but it's the third thing on the list, but it's before everything else. And work comes number four. I don't have to put it on my list, it's understood. But the reason it's understood, for me to love properly my wife and children the way that I'm supposed to as a godly man, then that work is going to come before those other things on my list. Yeah. But again, I don't have to list work as a priority. And I shouldn't list it because I need to remember that people are more important than things. It's who, not what, that's important. I love God, I love my wife, and I love my kids. And because I love God, my wife, and my kids, I work. But I always know why I'm working. And that keeps me from having misplaced priorities. That keeps me from putting work before my family. I'm going to tell you a true story if you guys don't mind. Early in my ministry, I had a person that was on our board, no longer on our board. Doesn't come to church here. But after church on Wednesday night, he'd always keep me, and he'd talk for an hour and 15 minutes. And my girls would sit in the hallway waiting for me to go. You know, I'd say, boy, I really need to go. My kids have school tomorrow evening. And he'd just keep on talking. One day I stopped and said, whoa. You need to understand something. You're not top priority on my list. My kids are. You see them sitting down there? They're tired. They have school tomorrow. No more. You want to talk with me? You come before Wednesday night. But after Wednesday night service, we're going home. Now, he was on my board. There were some repercussions after that. But you need to understand, my kids come first. Why? Because that's what God's word says. But that's also why I don't put work before my family. I work because of my family. You know, I've always told my secretaries, if one of my family members call, you put that call through. Doesn't matter what's going on. If someone came in and they're having marriage problems, they're talking to me, and one of my kids called, Rosita, Shirley, Julie, they would put them on through. And I'd pick up and say, hey, what's going on? Yeah. Things going all right? Uh-huh. Anything pressing? No? Okay. Hey, do you mind? I've got someone in my office. Can I get back with you? Okay, I'll call you right back. Just a little bit. Thanks. And hang up. Now, I want you to understand, if something would have been pressing, if they needed me, my kids would take priority of those people in my office. And I know some of you going, oh, that's just not right. Didn't you take an oath or something? No, I didn't take no oath. I got saved just like you got saved. I got called to the ministry like everyone else that got called to the ministry. But I understand what the Bible says, and I want you to understand, if that person in my office who's got marriage problems, I'm not going to fix their marriage problems in 15 minutes. It's taken 30 years to get them to that point. And God doesn't fix marriages. God fixes people, and they're screwed up. It's going to take a lot of work. But I want my kids to know they're more important. You know, I was really scared, I have to be honest, and I thank God my kids are in church today. But they would say this, they love God and they love church, but they don't like church people because of what they've seen and how they've been abused. And I tried my best to protect them from it, but sometimes I couldn't. But I'm here to tell you, my kids take priority. And I've always told my secretaries that. And I'm saying this because I'm trying to teach you men that what you do for a living is not more important than who you're providing for. The whole reason you're working is for your kids, for your wife, and to glorify God. That's good teaching, Pastor Allen. Now, let me give you a principle concerning priorities. And if you're taking notes, I want you to write this down. As a creature of free will, man has the ability to choose what his priorities will be. That's right. As a creature of free will, you have the ability to decide what's going to take priority in your life. You can choose to make God number one in your life or not. You can choose whether your work will take priority over your family or whether your family will take priority over your work. It's all up to you, and let me prove it to you. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Joshua, chapter 24, verse 15. Notice what it says. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. In other words, if you don't want to serve the Lord, that's your prerogative. So choose for yourself who or what you're going to serve. You see, the only reason it doesn't give another opportunity in there is because in that day and time when this was written, everyone served gods. That was just understood. But basically what it's saying is you just determine who or what you want to serve. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that man has the ability to choose what his priorities are going to be. Now, Jesus has told us that our number one priority should be to love God. We're to love him with all our heart, soul, and mind. Our second priority is to love others as ourselves. But if we choose not to do that, that's our prerogative because we are creatures of free will. But I promise you there will be consequences. So how do you know if God is your number one priority? Because it's easy to say that He is, but actions speak louder than words. And that's especially true when it comes to your priorities. You see, your actions will reveal what your true priorities are. In other words, it's easy to say that you love God and that God is number one. It's easy to say that you love your wife and she's number two. It's easy to say that your kids are number three in your list of priorities. But your actions will reveal whether that's true or not. Now, let me show you something interesting. Go back to Matthew chapter 22. Let's read verses 35 through 38. Notice what it says. One of them, an expert in religious law, tried to trap him with this question. Teacher, which is the most important commandment in the law of Moses? Jesus replied, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. It's not just the first commandment, it's the greatest commandment. It's not just the greatest commandment, it's the first commandment. Yeah. Now, most of us equate love with a feeling. So this command to love God with all of our heart, soul, and mind almost seems impossible to do because we want to love God more than anyone or anything, but for most of us, the feelings just aren't there. So even though we want to obey this command and love God with all of our heart, soul, and mind, most of us feel like we can't. We feel like we're incapable of doing this because the feelings just aren't there. Well, let me share two very important truths with you. This command is not talking about feelings. You see, the word love is translated from the Greek word agapao. It's a verb, so that's the way it is, agapao, with its case endings. If it was a noun and was referring to the agape type of love, it would be pronounced agape. But this is the Greek word agapao. And agapao is a special kind of love. Many times it's referred to as the God kind of love because it's a self-sacrificing love. The type of love that benefits others at the expense of self. But here's what's interesting. It's not a feeling. It's a choice. It's a decision to serve someone else or do something for someone else at the expense of yourself. In fact, a good example of this is John 3:16. For God so loved, and that word love there is agapao. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoso believeth in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. Yeah. Now I want you to understand something about God. God loves every one of you, but God doesn't necessarily like you. I don't like many of you. There's not much to like with many of you. You're not faithful to your wife. You cheat, you cuss, you lie, you steal, you do all these type of things. Yeah. And maybe you don't do those things, but you do other things. But I want you to understand something. Even though God might not necessarily like you, God loves you. And while you were yet a sinner, Christ died for you. Because God loves you, He has this self-sacrificing love. It's not really a feeling. He didn't go, oh man, I just feel something for Allen Nolan. I just feel like I love him so much, I'm going to send Jesus to die for him. No. In fact, before I got saved, there wasn't much to like. I doubt very seriously that God liked me. Now, right now, I'm one of God's favorites. You got some work to do, but I'm there. But before I got saved, I don't think God liked me. But you know what? God loved me. And He made a choice. He made a decision to give His Son up for me. And Jesus died for my sins. His soul went to hell and paid the penalty for my sins. And God raised Him from the dead because He loved me. So the first thing I want you to understand about this is when God talks about the first command being to love God with all our heart, soul, and mind, He's not really talking about a feeling. He didn't say to eros love God. He didn't use phileo. He didn't use stergo. He used agape. In the verb form, it's agapao. It's not a feeling. However, because we're emotional creatures, we want to feel love, right? You know, we're emotional creatures. If you ever go to seminary and you study theology or study the attributes of God, you'll find out that God has something called the impassibility of God. In other words, he's not moved by feelings like we are. Yes, he's a jealous God. He can get angry. He can love. He can do all of these things. But it's not the way that we do. And you'll find out about the aseity of God. There's not anything you can give God that he really needs. He's self-sufficient in and of himself. But I want you to understand, we're created with emotions. And because we're emotional creatures, we want to feel love. And people, nothing's wrong with that. If we love someone, we should feel that love, right? So let me give you the second important truth that everyone needs to know. And here it is. The way you feel about God is affected by the way you treat him. Let me say that again. Because most of you don't feel the love for God the way you think you should. In other words, the feelings of love just aren't there. Not the way that you love your spouse, not the way that you love your family, not the way that you love your kids. So let me say that again. The way you feel about God is affected by the way you treat him. In fact, how many of you remember the praxis principle? One of the most important principles you'll ever learn. In fact, you ought to write it down in your Bible, and you need to memorize it. Here's the praxis principle. This is what it states. The way you treat people affects the way you feel about them. In other words, the way you treat someone affects the way that you feel about them. And I'll give you some examples to illustrate what I'm talking about. If you treat your wife like she's a princess, that will affect the way you feel about her. Pretty soon you'll begin to feel like she's a princess. You'll feel like she's the most important thing in your life. You'll feel like she's the most valuable thing. And I always say this, it's not like my wife's a possession. But I tell my kids this, they're not a possession, but I tell both of my girls, you're the most valuable possession that I have. And my wife is the most valuable possession I have. And I feel that way. On the other hand, if you treat your wife like she's garbage, that will affect the way that you feel about her. Pretty soon you'll begin to feel like she's beneath you, that she's not worthy of your love. And you'll want to discard her and trade her in for someone new. Because in the back of your mind, you'll think you can do better. If you think you can do better than your spouse, I can guarantee the reason you feel that way is because you don't treat your spouse right. And women, this applies to you as well. If you treat your husband with respect, it will affect the way you feel about him. Pretty soon you'll begin to feel like he's deserving of respect. But if you treat him disrespectfully, pretty soon you'll begin to feel like he's not worthy of your respect. You'll begin to feel like you could do better. People, that's the praxis principle. So, do you want to know why most of you don't feel like God is number one in your life? It's because you don't treat him like he's number one in your life. Let me say that again. Do you want to know why you don't feel like God is number one in your life? It's because you don't treat him like he's number one in your life. If you start treating God like he's number one in your life, you'll begin to feel like he's number one in your life. Now, you might be asking, but how do I create feelings of love for God? Well, I'll tell you how. You start by spending time with God in prayer, the Word, and meditation. And you might not feel anything in the beginning, but eventually it will affect the way you feel about God. Yeah. This is where I pray. This is where I sit. I sit right there in the morning. I come in here and I start meditating on who God is. Because God is eternal. That means he has no beginning. Everything else has a beginning. Everything else was created by God, but not God. And I start thinking about his attributes and who he is. And then I start praying, and I use the Lord's Prayer as an outline. And I start walking up and down here. And you're probably wondering why in the world I'm crying and I'm tearing up. It's because God talks to me. And I feel the presence of God. And I feel him talking to me. And I receive words of knowledge, which is one of the manifestation gifts. And I'll receive words of wisdom. And God will start giving me revelation. And he'll start dealing with things in my life. And sometimes I go, I got to get to work, God. I'm going to have to go. I got things I got to do. But this was so good. And then I go in and I pull out my Bible. And I do my daily Bible reading, and then I journal about it. I journal my quiet time. And the revelation that God gives me is just so beautiful. And then I put at the bottom why I'm always thankful. And sometimes I'm repetitive. God, I'm so thankful that you're present and you're here. I'm so thankful for what you give me. Now, if you wonder why in the world I tear up a lot, I'll be preaching and all of a sudden I tear up and I'll stop and I'll catch myself. But it's because I feel God. And I feel him talking to me. And I have to be honest with you, I'm probably closer to God than I am to a lot of people. But that comes with spending time with God. And if you don't feel God, and you know you should love him, but you know, I'm loving him, I'm doing these things, and you go, but I don't feel this love. I want you to understand the praxis principle. The way we treat someone affects the way we feel about them. And if I start treating God the way I should, that he's number one, so I'm going to spend time with him in prayer and in the Word, and I'm going to meditate on the Word, and I'm going to meditate on who he is, pretty soon, and it takes a while. When I first started praying, I prayed because I was supposed to pray. When I first started reading the Bible, I just suppose I was supposed to do that. But the more I began to do it, the more it began to change me. And that's what the praxis principle is saying. It's a very powerful principle. I've told you this principle before, or this story before to illustrate this principle, but I'm going to say it again because it bears repeating. There was a man that had become very bitter towards his wife. And he not only wanted to divorce his wife, he really wanted to hurt her very deeply. But he lived in a state where it was had community rights, so that means that she'd get half of everything. And so he couldn't really do anything that would take away that. So he thought, how can I really hurt my wife? So he went to see a person who he thought was very wise, and he said, I really want to hurt my wife. I just think that she's ruined my life, and I want to make sure I'm going to divorce her, but I want to make sure that I hurt her as bad as she's hurt me. And the guy was pretty wise. He said, well, I'll tell you what you need to do. He said, if you really want to hurt your wife, he said, oh, I do. He said, I'll tell you what you do. For the next 3 months, you just treat her like she's a queen. I want you to go home. And he said, you just compliment her every day. You get up, you make the coffee, you take her coffee in bed. He said, you begin to do all the things that you did when you were dating, and you just treat her the best you can treat her. And you do that for 3 months. And said, what'll happen is she'll just think that you're the greatest thing in the world, and then that's when you, bam, serve her the papers. You divorce her. So the guy thought, man, that is ingenious. That's great. I'm going to go do that. So he goes home and he begins to do that. 3 months later, the guy doesn't receive a phone call, so he's wondering, what happened? 4 months pass, 5 months pass, 6 months pass. Finally, he calls the guy and he says, you came to see me 6 months ago and you talked about hating your wife, and you said that you were going to try and hurt her. He said, I haven't heard from you. What took place? How did that turn out? He says, well, why in the world would I want to divorce her? She's the greatest thing in the world. I love her so much. What changed? The way he treated her. The way you treat someone affects the way you feel about them. If you want to have these feelings for God, well, you need to understand it doesn't start with the feeling. It starts with the choice, the decision, and that's what agapao is. Agapao. It's the God kind of love. Regardless of how you feel, you begin to treat God like he's number one in your life. You begin to do these things, and then what will take place is there'll be a transformation in your life. And pretty soon, you'll feel God. He'll speak to you. And pretty soon, you'll be like me. You'll think you're one of God's favorites. You and God are like this. And you want to know why you'll feel that way? Because you feel like you're this way with God.